There's just so much opportunity for new players operating in this world where it's not the kind of industry where one company is going to come and just like, check that box and move on, right? This is an industry and an industry we will see hundreds of $billion companies built in this world for the next decade or two.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Something New, the podcast where we talk about interesting things going on in tech for people building something new. Or at least people aspiring to build something new. I'm Lior.
And I'm Steph.
Think of us as a bit of a technical how I built this, but maybe a little bit less Guy Raz and a little bit more Guy Riz.
This is the peak, and then we're going downhill from here.
I'm using my podcast voice. What's going on, Steph?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. What are we talking about today?
I think we're talking about Lenny's how to raise a seed post that came out this week. Definitely got a lot of buzz on Twitter. Curious to hear what you think from a VC perspective, and then happy to share thoughts from founder perspective. But I'm curious of the advice given, if anything stood out to you about the process or any of the recommendations or anything you disagreed with.
There's a couple points I thought were pretty key. I mean, I think especially for pre-seed, I was actually having this conversation with a potential founder yesterday. And, in Lenny's article, and it's also written by, it's written by Jack Altman and Terence Rohan, who are both kind of early stage investors. Jack also formerly started Lattice. Terence was leading seed at Index and did Figma amongst kind of some other great companies as well. They talk about this concept of like before you raise, you have your proof of commitment, which is kind of leaving your job and, saying that you're actually starting a company. Proof of work, like kind of validating the insights and even doing customer development and kind of more specifically beyond kind of the customer development piece, they call it proof of insight as well, where it's some expression of the thesis, with kind of like understanding, all the different nooks and crannies that kind of pertain to an idea. And actually that did resonate a lot with me, especially on the pre-seed front. I mean, on the commitment side, maybe we can talk about in a second, but it's always interesting talking to founders who have done all the work up ahead of a raise or in the process of doing the work versus founders that are not. And I think you can definitely tell the difference. A lot of times that kind of exhibits through, you start to ask them questions and, you realize that the depth of knowledge isn't there yet. And maybe their answers to questions, it's not like I have the answers to all these questions, but you would expect someone else who's like really becoming an expert in the space to have those answers. And so, especially on the proof of work and kind of proof of insight, I think, as a founder, especially for a pre-seed, like if you're not kind of at least credibly able to tell yourself and others on those two dimensions, and even though inevitably things will change, I think you're kind of doing yourself a disservice.
Yeah, I guess, is there any world in which you would back a founder that has not yet quit their job but intends to? And I ask because I feel like that's actually a very common thing that I hear. People are trying to raise before they quit their job. And on one hand, I actually really do understand that, right? If you can't raise, which is a very real possibility for a lot of people, like the possibility of not having an income, especially when you're older and have a family to support, et cetera, is, it's a meaningful sacrifice. But I do find that interesting. Like that's such a strong signal that people focus on. Like what degree do people need to show commitment that they're all in on this new thing?
Yeah, I think it depends. It depends on two things, I think. One, if you're like a Google engineer who's like 30 years old and you've been at Google for 8 years and you're single, and like if you made like $400,000 a year every single year, since you graduated or whatever it is on average, then, it's kind of crazy to me that you're not quitting your job first. And, especially in certain big tech jobs where there is a predisposition of VCs to be skeptical of that person's kind of willingness to kind of take the risk and leap and do all these kinds of things that are necessary for a startup. I think that only reinforces that bias, I guess you could say. That said, if you're someone who's a little bit younger or, maybe has to support a family and there's like a real reason as to why that's the case, then I'm totally open to that. I think it kind of just depends on the situation. I think additionally, if you're not going to have quit your job before, which, I've done that before. I haven't actually, you can't invest while they're still at the employer, but you can kind of have like a handshake agreement. In those situations, there has been a reason as to why. And so I was like, okay, I can get beyond this. And then that person also did so much work on the other fronts. I just think it raises the bar for what needs to be done on all the other fronts. And so in general, when it comes to a fundraise, especially a pre-seed, if you're going to be, I don't know if the right word is deficient, but let's call it deficient in one of those criteria, then you just have to make sure you're exceptional in the others. And so just the bar is being raised in all other areas. If you're going to, maybe purposefully or not, be a little bit lacking in one of the spots.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like that's also an element of what people mean by storytelling, right?
Yeah.
Like I think everything is scrutinized in a pitch, and it's not just the deck or the idea or the literal questions, but it's kind of like the circumstances around it, like kind of to your point, like signals of commitment and other things. So anyway, I just think that's interesting. It can maybe like overlooked. And then kind of to your point, one thing that I've thought a lot about when people ask about fundraising is, why is it true that someone can raise like pre-product or pre-revenue at like an insane valuation and others like can't raise even though they have like $1 million of ARR and whatever else. And there's a lot of factors to that, but kind of to your point about being quote unquote deficient in some areas and better in others. Like I actually do think about fundraising and evaluation roughly in a, like almost like a rubric and like a points format, like if you're an ex OpenAI engineer who was super senior, who was like a co-founder or whatever, right? Like you're going to be able to raise at like exceptional terms versus like if you don't have that background, you won't. And that's like a very extreme literal example.
I think that's right though.
That people use to do that. So anyway, I just think that's interesting. The couple other ones that I found, or like points that I thought were interesting, maybe like not as obvious to me, like not coming from the investor perspective anymore. One was, they talk about FOMO, and that's obvious to me at least, that, driving people through this process and momentum, very key to fundraising. But I love how they even call out actually that signals from your current investors are also really important. So they have something in there that's like, follow up sparingly with investors and never chase or back channel them without strife. And I was like, I don't know. I don't understand what that means. But they basically say that you shouldn't have, or your current investors should not be chasing these prospective leads, because that in itself is a bad signal that there's a potentially desperation kind of behind the scene that this company really needs funding, which I thought was interesting. You not only have to control like yourself and maybe your team or your co-founder or whatever from doing stuff, but it's like also like keeping your investors kind of like calming them down and keeping them and prevent bad signal, which I thought was kind of funny to acknowledge.
Yeah. Well, oh my God, I was just talking about this with someone today as well. There's also certain investors who are always talking their book. And
wait, what does that mean?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So basically every investment they've ever done is the best investment in the history of the world.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And so look, it's a balance from investor standpoint. You want to like talk nicely about your companies, but when you're having like a one-on-one conversation with an investor, you might not call out that company specifically by name, but if a company that, like, I've been in situations where someone's telling me about a company where I have a friend who's at that company, who's a co-founder, and they're more honest to me about how the company is working than the investor who's invested in the company. And that just makes me discount like everything they're saying, because I just assume they're just, talking crap. I think there's a way to still be positive while also maintaining, a little bit of like, having a little bit of like a spine kind of beyond, like against what you're saying. And so there's like a balance. I think on the point of like referencing, I think in general, I think it probably doesn't work unless like the times in which it does, that person, has to either be very, very good at that skill because it's hard to balance, or they have to be someone that like knows both parties exceptionally well. And so it doesn't feel like cheesy or canned. And so I think there's an elegant way to potentially do that.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was funny. They literally say, if there's any sort of back channel that works, it's having an angel or existing investor say they vouched for the lead check as a type of reference, like going to the potential investor being like, oh, FYI, I told the founder that you guys are really cool. I'm like, oh, that is like, they're like, oh, you like flip the power dynamic. And I was like, oh, that is actually very clever. Like, you do flip the power dynamic. Like you make it sound like you're helping them out. Anyway, so I just thought it was funny. It's like, like it's about not only to think about yourself and your, like, I don't know how you present yourself, but it's like I don't know, your team and, your current investors as part of that. I thought it was just kind of funny.
Yeah. There's also, though, people to like, slightly play devil's advocate with the article. Even though I actually think there's a lot of great stuff here, is that like, there are people, I've seen a lot of people win the fundraise, and, that's also an issue in and of itself. And so you want to make sure, and the article does talk about this a little bit. And so I want to give it a little bit of credit on that, to mention, like, I've had situations where, and actually like tweeted about this yesterday, where, a lot of like, I was like, or situations where friends were like the only term sheet. And in some cases, obviously those companies don't do well. And by all accounts, they kind of didn't win the fundraise. And many times those companies, I would argue, like, outperform the companies that did. And so, I think that's just kind of like my general take on this whole phenomenon, even though if I were a founder, I would want to have this information too.
Yeah, no, 100%.
My dream is, and hopefully this is the founder's dream too, is you raise, a little bit of money and never raise again. Like I have a company now doing $25 million of revenue. They've raised like $10 million.
Yeah.
And so that's amazing. And there's, in certain instances, you if you're building a certain kind of company, you're not going to be able to get there. But the founders are going to make a lot more money when they sell the business, or, something bigger happens, because of that dynamic. They kind of essentially skipped around.
I was going to say, I think that's a really interesting point on dilution and raising money, all that kind of stuff too. And something I appreciated about the article is that they had a couple of light benchmarks, and I wish they had leaned into that more. They were saying, like, you shouldn't dilute yourself more than 40% after the Series A. I still, to this day, like, obviously I've been in VC so long, I still get pinged by people all the time asking, like, what's a reasonable amount to be diluted? Yeah. And I feel like actually an investor perspective on this topic that would be really helpful is more data and insight into even like how they would, how investors would coach their own companies thinking about valuation dilution in follow-on rounds, for example, and more data around that.
Yeah, there was an investor recently who was just talking about that dynamic where the founder had diluted themselves so much that it kind of was a negative signal that the founder was like too loose with their equity after like a pre-seed. And so I think that I actually love the fact they have that little grid, because if I saw a situation where the founders, had given up like 40 to 50% of their company, like at a pre-seed, I would assume it would be an incubation. And if it's not, then I'm like, why? What is going on here? And even if it was an incubation, then there's the question is like, all right, like, why were they willing to accept a 50% haircut? And maybe there's good reasons for that, and sometimes there's not. Great conversation on those fronts. Talk about someone who also had to think through his early kind of fundraising experiences. Our next guest is Zane Mountcastle. Zane's someone I've known for, 4 years or so. Met him when he was kind of just kicking off, starting Picogrid kind of in early 2020. Actually was originally introduced to him, Steph, by a mutual friend of ours, Matt Prusak.
Cool.
Makes sense.
Cool. Yeah.
Zane's someone who, was kind of working as a contractor and then engineer for the U.S. Army, and realized that there was kind of this gap in starting with base defense. And so where Picogrid got started was essentially helping create these, unmanned systems to help bases guard themselves against, potentially like enemy, insurgents or whatnot, but also, from anyone who's kind of starting to come onto the territory of the base. And from that, this is not a perfect analogy, but essentially what he's trying to do is build the military's version of essentially like a plaid for being able to deploy, autonomous systems. And what that means in the military context is very different from a software context, essentially creating like a physical box. And actually visited Zane in Segundo and got to check it out a little bit and kind of play around with some of the stuff they had in the factory. Essentially allows folks to better able to deploy autonomous systems kind of on the ground in the military, not just now on bases, but now around the world, including in kind of combat zones as well. Right now, it's always been a big problem, be able to properly kind of manage and deploy your system without some locus of control, so to speak. And so, saying someone who kind of was in an area where in defense tech where it was not necessarily hot at first and kind of maneuvered through, both a down cycle for defense and an up one. And is also one of the key members of the El Segundo kind of defense tech community that's kind of emerged over the course of time. So we chat with him on kind of how he was able to kind of convince folks on the Picogrid front, and also what it's like to kind of be at the epicenter of a new wave of startups. It's, not just SF plus defense, but actually something different. And so without further ado, Zane, really, really appreciate you joining Steph and I today.
Thanks for having me.
I came to see you in person, I want to say like a month ago. And one of the things that's captured the imagination of, VCs everywhere and founders as well is this whole thing called the Gundo. Would love to hear, before we get into specifically what Picogrid is up to, just how did this whole movement happen? Maybe, did you all just come together and decide that you wanted to do this? Like what happened? Why is the Gundo now a thing?
Yeah, I mean, it was partially deliberate, partially organic. So the backstory there is the Gundo being El Segundo, California, which is a small neighborhood next to LAX and the beach. It's about a mile or two down the road from SpaceX, and it's just a collection, or part of it is a collection of these 4,000 to 5,000 square foot warehouses. A lot of them built in the 50s and 60s. At one point had been home to a bunch of different defense contractors. The building I'm sitting in right now was built by Hughes Aircraft in 1953. And a lot of them had a lot of that history. And, fast forward, SpaceX was actually started in El Segundo and moved up the street to Hawthorne in the early 2000s. Then at a SpaceX, you had the second generation of companies that were built largely by ex-SpaceX employees. So that's Intel Space, that's Varda, that's Impulse Space, that's a bunch of the companies that kind of settle in the area. And also, it's just a nice place to be. Honestly, it's a very cute town, nice little downtown, right by the ocean, right? It's a very attractive place. And so, I mean, that's been kind of going on for the last, 10, 20 years or so. And then in the past, really 18 months, a bunch of these guys, many of whom I met on Twitter, kind of all coalesced on the same place at the same time. We all kind of ended up running out warehouses, and I think we kind of got together, and part of it was deliberate. Like, look, we need to hire people. We need to bring capital to this area. The first time, I went out raising, I never even told people where I was at, other than just LA. And people looked at me like, why would I be in LA? I could be in San Francisco. The truth is, like, LA is a better place to build this kind of company, where you have the manufacturing, you have the engineers, you have the skill set you need to build the kind of company that we're building. Segundo is a really good place, sort of a hotbed for that. And so, it kind of got together and decided we're just going to show this thing on Twitter and manifested a movement that, the first time we realized how powerful it was when people were unironically comparing El Segundo and San Francisco, where El Segundo is maybe, a dozen or 2 dozen companies in a small area. And you're talking about San Francisco with however many tens of billions of dollars of capital every year. And so it's like, oh, El Segundo will never, like, San Francisco is this or that, it's better than El Segundo. It's like, you're now comparing this small little, spit of land to San Francisco, California, and you don't realize the irony. Like, we've won. It doesn't matter if San Francisco has this or that, it's better. Like, we've won. And that's been a really, really fun experience. And I think it's attracting a different type of engineer and a different type of company in San Francisco. And that's very deliberate, right? We're not trying to be, San Francisco light in Southern California. I mean, other cities have tried this, right? Like San Francisco with palm trees, or San Francisco, like, Silicon Alley or Silicon Beach or whatever. There's been a couple of these. And we're explicitly not that. Like, we are not San Francisco. You want to, go build San Francisco tech, go to San Francisco, right? It's a great place. There's a lot of good engineers. It's a good place to be. But this is not that. And, I think being clear about what we're not has been very, very helpful for building the movement and kind of, drawing a lot of people to us.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys follow Lulu Iservi, I think is her last name, on Twitter. She's like the comms woman, but one thing that she says, she advocates for like founders going direct. But one thing that she says that I love is like, you're not going to, or you shouldn't want to please everyone. Like really actually how you attract the right people, like exactly to your point, Zane, is like stating exactly what you are and exactly what you're not, and attracting the people who believe what you believe, which is really awesome. So sounds cool.
What is it kind of the whole experience taught you about like building movements, even as it relates specifically to Picogrid? Like, how do you think about like the process of drumming interest in an interesting way such that you can take advantage of some of these like secondary and tertiary impacts of what a movement provides?
Yeah, I mean, mission matters. It really does. And I think the kind of technology that we're building in Segundo, I think people think about it and like they class it broadly as defense technology. It's really not only defense technology, right? It's defense and industrials and energy. I still don't really like any good term for it, right? There's American dynamism, which is still very vague. There's global resilience, which is also kind of vague. But I don't have a better term. So, in that ballpark, it's kind of where we fall. And I think it's very easy to get people excited about the mission when it actually matters, right? When we're not building some kind of, another enterprise sales SaaS application that is, even if it was tremendously successful, would add a couple percentage of revenue to some big company that, also doesn't really build anything of value. Like, it's just hard to get yourself up in the morning for years and years at a time and work really hard to do that kind of thing. At least it is for me, right? I couldn't do that, right? And I very much know that. And I think what we found is that resonates with a lot of people. And so I think it's just, be very clear about the mission, be very transparent about it. And I think the passion really resonates with a lot of people, and it really attracts kind of the right people, but also it dissuades other types of people, right? If you're just trying to, go have a nice, cushy, easy job, don't come to Segundo, right? Don't. It's not like we're working with large machines. We're working in a type of industry that's definitely uncomfortable a lot of the time, and it's definitely not for everyone. But I think that being clear about which is which is important for bringing the right people to the place.
Totally different, not just better. I think is the way that I think of it, and at least what I've observed from you all, which has been super interesting to see. Maybe let's back up a little bit. You're
Sure.
at NYU. You're kind of thinking about what to do next. You end up getting involved with the U.S. Army a bit. Talk about, how did that come about? What was the process like for starting Mission Mule as well, and kind of your work with the U.S. Army?
So I was in undergrad working in a research lab at NYU on something completely different, and I was just kind of working alongside these guys who were building some really interesting tech using around autonomous systems and drones and sensor systems, and ended up one weekend just rewriting their entire software stack because I was just so frustrated with like having to deal with all of their electrical engineering issues that were largely tied down to software. So went and rebuilt that, and then got more and more involved with the project. And then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers actually reached out to us, and they're saying like, hey, this technology has applications here and there, and there's a contract vehicle we're bidding out. Long story short, we ended up winning that. I was still an undergrad. That was late 2017, early 2018. Then ended up turning down a couple offers to go do a more traditional software engineering route, and then spent a couple years. I was in the East Bay in Bay Area, working and building this tech and deploying it across installations across mostly the Southwest U.S. And that was a really interesting experience because I got to see a phase of defense technology that most people, including most people in the military, never get to see. Right, the earliest stages where tech is being tested and fielded for the very first time, and it is a very messy phase. Right, it was really interesting because I got to see kind of where that works, but where it doesn't. This was 2018, 2019, and at the time, nobody wanted to touch defense technology. Right, it felt sort of heretical to even be in that space. Which was insane to me, right? I think, that was my first experience working with the military. I didn't have anything against it. I just never really had that opportunity before. But I was, living in the Bay Area, and I'd tell folks, what I was doing at parties or whatever, and I would hear, oh, why would you do that? Like, it's that, working with the military is evil, or this or that. It's like that was kind of the broader, general sentiment, and it was really disheartening for me to see that sort of be so, I guess, looked down upon. Mm-hmm. In despite the fact that they're building really, really essential technology that is protecting all of us across the country, all benefit from, and it's just so important. And the deeper I got into that world, the more I realized, like, wow, there's actually a lot to be built here across every problem set, across every use case. There's so much to be built, and there's also tons and tons and tons of money, right? And for people to say, hey, defense is not investable is silly, right? It's truly insane when you're talking about an industry that has a budget of $880 billion in the US alone. About half of that's going towards technology. This is a massive, massive industry. And there's just so much to be built. And of course, it has its own problems for sure. But so does every industry. And there's a lot of sort of blue ocean to build in.
I'm curious what it's been like for you, like seeing, like you got into the industry before it became cool amongst VCs, and now you're literally building a company, and this, you mentioned American dynamism and everything earlier. Like, what is that like transition and contrast like been like for you witnessing that, and now obviously being so ingrained in it and leading it?
Yeah, it's been really astonishing, honestly. I was very surprised at how quick it happened. Where we went from 2018, 2019. Nobody would touch it, right? People looked at it as evil or stupid or both to be operating in the space. To all of a sudden, 2020, 2021, and now it's the hot thing, right? And that flip was so quick. Where honestly, I'm a little wary of people who've joined the space since then, because a lot of it's just kind of chasing the latest hot thing. Mm-hmm. We've seen this with other industries, right? It's not unique to this industry, right? There's a whole crypto wave. There's the current AI wave. Like there's a lot of kind of tourists that are just chasing whatever VCs say is hot these days, and those are also the people that when things move on, they're also going to leave the space, right? They're it's pretty easy to kind of pick those out. I think there is some genuine interest in the space, and some people that are in the space now are very, very serious, and will be here for the long term. When the wave passes, or when something bad happens in the industry, they'll also be around. But it's I am definitely wary of it, but I am cautiously optimistic that now there's capital moving into this space that has desperately needed it for a very, very long time, right? And there's just so much opportunity for new players operating in this world, where it's not the kind of industry where one company is going to come and just check that box and move on, right? This is an industry, and an industry we will see hundreds of billion-dollar companies built in this world in the next decade or two. And that's what I think people are starting to realize now.
Very cool. Right. I saw this interview that you had done where you make a joke about how you had to answer a lot of silly questions recently because you guys had just gotten done with a fundraise. And so I imagine those are signals of maybe the tourist VCs you mentioned. I'm curious if there are any common questions or stereotypes of questions that you get that are dead giveaways that someone is maybe not as serious about the space as you are.
I don't want to pick on anyone in particular. I think I appreciate that people are trying to learn, is a nice way to say it. I think one of the big common misperceptions of this world is that the government is a single customer, right? And that you're going to sell to Joe Biden, and you walk into his office and selling. It's not how it works at all, right? The military, the budget comes from Congress, but it flows down into literally thousands of different organizations, right? That all have their own purchasing authority, that all have their own types of contracts, that all have their own priorities. And oftentimes those are competing, right? And you have politics, and you have, just like any other industry, you'll have relationships and politics and challenges towards selling. And that's who you're actually selling into, right? You're not selling to a nebulous government, right? That doesn't exist. There isn't a government entity to buy your technology. There's thousands of them. And that's what I think people really need to realize. Because when you think about that from the first perspective of there is a single government, it's okay, well, that whoever wins that government wins the contract forever, and that's it, period. Versus look, now we're talking about an industry, and people can actually be building very competitive competing technology and both do very, very well. because they capture different organizations in different ways. And I think it makes it a little bit more of an organic space than people will seem to realize. Looking at it, from the surface.
You were quoted in your fundraising announcement, which we can talk about a little bit later. It was a gut punch as an engineer trained in modern software. Every sensor, plane, vehicle, and command center operates as an independent system with no way to work together. How did we get to this point? Because obviously it's incredible that there's an opportunity to build what Picogrid is, but at the same time, it's one of those things that I think for folks that are coming into the space more recently, it's kind of wild that we're at this point at the same time. So curious, as you were observing this opportunity, how did you think of a way to kind of penetrate it in a world in which many folks, might have tried and failed?
It's very much an incentives problem in this world, where the way that the technology has historically been built, and goes back, decades, is technology is built to a set of requirements. Those requirements are bid out as an RFP. And the company wins the contract to build towards the RFP. They're typically cost plus contracts when you get to larger contracts. And that's just a nice way to say these are engineering services. So I'm going to pay you for the engineering hours you put into building this thing plus some margin. That's it. And so it is your incentive or you're legally obligated to only build towards those requirements. You have no incentive to build anything outside of that because you're not going to get paid for that. And the same thing, you don't want to actually build anything that's going to kind of outcompete you in the future. But you're an engineering services company. You're not going to try to build infrastructure that'll cut down engineering hours down the road. That'd be silly to do. And so what you end up with is a bunch of very tightly integrated vertical systems that do work. And I think the common narrative in this world is, oh, hey, all these large projects are bad. They're really not. Actually, a lot of the technology building is really astonishingly advanced and has been for a long time. Right? I mean, all the technology we're using today in our day-to-day lives, a lot of it was built by the military decades ahead of its time. Like the internet itself, GPS, all these radio, all these things are fundamentally military systems that were then adopted by the rest of the world. So there is good technology being built, but it's an incentives problem, right? Where we have these tightly integrated vertical systems that do work in and of themselves, but don't work together. And so what you end up with is a world in which you have this one-to-one relationship between the users and the systems they operate. Right? So one user is now operating one camera, one user is operating one drone, or often you have actually multiple users operating one system, which happens a lot. And that's not where we need it. We can't operate that way, right? And I think what the real sort of why now of why this is changing, now is we're seeing this explosion of unmanned systems and autonomous systems in a way we've never seen before, where we are simply out of manpower, period. That's the limitations. We don't have enough humans to control at once millions upon millions of unmanned systems, right? We just don't have that. I just got a crazy text. At one point, it was a joke where between us and one of our other investors, every time we'd have our every 2 or 3 week sync, every single call, in the middle of the call, we got a contract for 2 months straight. I don't know. I don't know how this happened.
Any startup would be happy with that kind of luck. That's awesome.
No, it was amazing. It was a great thing, but it was so funny just that to happen. But anyways,
I mean, Steph and I are happy to schedule a podcast every other week with you, and we'll just kind of roll it.
Yeah, no, I mean, hey, if that's a great way to make these things happen, I'll happily do that.
I love that.
No, to get back to the other point is it's a broadly incentives driven industry, and so the incentives are to not do that, right? And so we've seen this industry develop to the point where we have a lot of really advanced technologies, some advanced, some not, some kind of bleed behind the times, but some of them are actually really advanced, right? But they don't work together because they've all been developed independently. Yeah. And we've seen this. The fascinating thing is the military understands this problem. Actually, they speak to this in the top duty requirements coming out of Pentagon every year, and they have for the last 5 or 10 years. It's gone over multiple iterations. More currently, it's called CJAD C2, Combined Joint All-Domain Command and Control, which the sort of high level for that is just making a system of systems. So all these different devices and all these different military systems of all types, all the way from tiny sensors all the way to the largest, most advanced fighter jets and the weapons platforms, can work together. right, autonomously. And the military's been speaking about that for years. The ironic thing is the way they're actually bidding out technology for this, and they're bidding out to the tune of billions of dollars a year, is the same mistake that's caused us in this place, that got us got us to where we are today in the first place, which is we're going to bid out a system that connects all different systems, and that's going to be developed independently, like by itself.
Yeah.
And now we're going to, and so like the insane part is like that's obviously never going to work, right? You might end up with like a nice API, but the API doesn't actually do anything, right? And so like the approach that we took was very sort of bottoms up, and it's very counterintuitive and really goes against all the incentive structures of how this industry operates. Just start at the end user. Seems obvious, right? Like start where the technology is being used. Start in real applications. And sure, the applications we started with were not sexy. But there are applications that weren't being served by anyone else. It was a huge sort of advantage for us as a company early on to get our foot in the door. Because we, at that stage, we couldn't compete with like Raytheon, or we couldn't compete with L3 or Lockheed, or like we just we couldn't compete. We could compete with two guys in a truck, which is how those problem sets were being solved in the first place. And that's what we did. And started scaling out of that, and building technology that's so desperately needed in this world, right? Building this middleware to connect those different systems that never really work together, but doing so in a very different approach, a very different business model, and I think that's what really matters. It's just like the approach to how you build technology. It's not necessarily technology itself.
I'm really curious about, you kind of alluded to earlier how, you were at the really early stages of seeing technology built when you were working with US Army. And I'm so curious about what that's like, because the stakes are so high. Like the early stages are the most delicate. Like they're really, obviously things are uncharted, and, there's just so many risks to de-risk. And I imagine so different from doing it at a traditional, SaaS company like we talked about earlier. I'm curious how you balance that. It sounds like you obviously have to balance like speed and scaling and all of that, even with Picogrid today, but also being secure and trustworthy and all that, because the stakes are really high. I'm curious about that balance that you probably experience more so than the average founder.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think the cost of failure is very high when you're in, say, combat operations.
Yeah.
And the military, the stuff that your day-to-day happens day-to-day in military is really, really high pressure. It has extremely global implications. And so the cost of failure is very high. I think like that's what has, sort of naturally bred a very conservative culture, a culture that is very resistant to change, because change is scary. And it's exceptionally scary when you adopt some new technology, you depend upon that in a context where, for whatever reason, that system fails, human lives are at risk. Very serious, like not in some abstract way, like, a lot of things we'll talk about, like with a lot of SaaS applications, but in a very, very real way. And so, we spend an exceptional amount of time working on solving reliability and security and performance of these systems. But at the same time, the model that we've sort of built out and developed is very advantageous to solving that in sort of a counterintuitive way, where typically we'll have these systems be built to a set of requirements, and they're tested and proven, and usually these are like multi-year contracts where they're tested in increasingly complex environments, going from lab testing to military exercises, all the way to it's actually fielded in military operations, like actual military operations. The challenge, though, is now you have a system that you developed largely from scratch, being tested and fielded effectively for the first time in real sort of scenarios, real operations. Obviously, anyone who's built technology understands that is a recipe for disaster, right? Because unless you've been testing this for years and years and years, something's going to go wrong, right? There's some bug, there's something that you have not considered that will pop up. And now you have to go fix that. And that can and does cost a lot. The cost of failure is so high. On the flip side, though, if we're taking the same infrastructure, the same proven backbone for this technology, and deploying it into a new set of operations, and what that means is all we're doing is adapting that last 5 or 10%, right? That last payload, that last integration, whether it's a hardware or software piece, we're able to now take advantage of the system we already know works and we already trust and has already been proven out for 10 times the number of sort of operational hours than the competing system. And we've already worked through all those bugs. We've already worked through the security issues. We've already
Yeah.
worked through reliability issues. And every time we fix a bug or fix a security hole or we fix some issue, that is now applicable across the fleet, right? Not just in this one use case, in this one environment where, even the best systems often have, you can count operational hours in like the hundreds, right? We're already talking about operational hours, I don't know, like, I don't even know, like, what it is at this point, but like, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of operational hours across the fleet now. And so we just have a more stable system that now, if you trust it in your day-to-day, even sort of boring road operations, you can now trust the system in a high-pressure scenario because you know how it works and you've relied on it before. And that's kind of like the durable advantage that we have over really any of these other companies that are building systems from scratch. Even if they are really good systems, they don't have the proof that we have,
right,
that our systems are actually better. They can say it's better. They can say it's 100% reliable, but that's just conjecture at that point. They don't have the proof to actually prove that. We do.
Maybe talk a little bit about some of your early deployments and what those look like. Because I think to your point, in kind of the end goal of building out this kind of middleware for the military, you ended up building out for these specific use cases for bases and with your first couple of deployments. So maybe talk a little about some of those and then kind of when did you know that you wanted to do it? It's like, okay, we ran this test against, kind of working with our users at the user level, and we want to, now kind of spend more of our engineering hours on infrastructure. And then the other thing I think is important to note is that this is hardware plus software. So maybe talk a little bit about that, your early deployment, and then that dynamic as
well. Yeah. So the first deployment that we had was solving, the first large deployment we had was solving this problem set for folks working in the range management office at a Luke Air Force Base. And their job is to administer the Berrien Goldwater Air Force Training Range, which is a bombing range in southern Arizona, a huge facility, I think over 1 million acres or so, covering probably about an eighth of the land area of the state of Arizona. So it's a massive, massive tract of land. So you had this small team, a few dozen people trying to manage this range, and that's everywhere from physical security, so people entering and exiting the range, both authorized and unauthorized. You have natural and cultural resources, which people don't realize the military actually cares about, but they do, which is managing wildlife that live on the military ranges. The military actually manages more land than the National Park Service, and all that goes into that is is a huge deal. And that's alongside all of the other operations that are going on. So training, this is one of the main sites for the F-35 training program, the big fighter jet program, and so the first application was deploying our systems to support a lot of these different challenges with the same technology across the range. So we deployed our tech on a couple of key points of interest around the range, both inside the range, but also on the perimeter of it, supporting some of the day-to-day operations of these people. And so now for the first time, instead of going to drive out into the desert for, it was actually a 6-hour drive one way to get to some of these sites from the Luke Air Force Base and near Phoenix. They now pulled up their computer and clicked on a button, and they were there. They could see real time, but also historic what's happening. Right? And so that's the actual end user capability that we delivered. Under the hood, we actually focused very early on building the platform layer first, and then building this as an application on top of it, which definitely took us longer than it would have if we just built a integrated system day one. But I think we had this intuitive understanding of what the problem space actually was. Right? It wasn't we need a camera system. It wasn't we need some kind of AI animal detection or something. It was deeper than that. That's one application on top of it. But the actual use case was building this middleware where now we could integrate different cameras or sensors, or we integrated microphones, weather stations, radar systems. So there's a multitude of different systems that the military depends on in different ways in different contexts. And so that was what we first did. And to get to the other part of the question was why hardware matters. Well, hardware actually allows us to solve these problems in the first place. Where the name of the company, Picogrid, is really a reference to solving that sort of day one problem, which is you don't have the hardware systems in the field, you don't have the data, which means you can't do anything with it, right? And you can build a really nice API, say, hey guys, come use it, and nobody does, right? Because you're not actually solving capability. You're just one part of a larger thing. And so for, but building the middleware for this industry, hardware is a big part of that, and we continue to build hardware. So Lando was our first platform, and last year we went from clean sheet design to combat operations with our second platform, Helios, which shares a lot of the same internal characteristics as Lander, but allows us to deploy that set of payloads and integrations into mobile operations that helps us serve combat and emergency response sort of use cases. We've already started working on our third and fourth hardware platform internally. We'll be announcing pretty soon on that front for different sets of operations and different sets of use cases. And for us, hardware is a way for us to deliver these capabilities into the field full stack. We operate, we serve the military, and the military is a very physical space, right? You cannot just be an entirely virtual experience or sort of virtual product, because you're not actually going to solve the real critical issues that people are going to have. Of course, there are some pure software applications in the military, and that's fine. But in the grand scheme of things, you're solving a small sliver of the broader problem sets out there. Do you want to solve it all? You kind of have to build hardware, and we've proven out we can do it. We can do it very quickly, and we can actually do it very cost effectively. Where last year we turned a profit for the first time, and for any company, that was actually before we even raised the seed round. For any company operating in this world, that's a very hard thing to do, especially with hardware. You can make it happen. You just have to be smart about it, which is what we tried to do early on.
How do you think about the kind of dichotomy on spending more time on the application side of things to continue to test out different kinds of applications built on top of these various platforms and whatnot, versus spending more time kind of at the infrastructure level and kind of trying to serve as a middleware provider? How do you think about balancing your time on both of those dimensions?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we don't really look at it as a binary. It's more of a continuum, where at the end of the day, we have to still deliver a capability, right? The platform layer is useless until we're delivering a capability. And we're very cognizant and very aware of that. And so usually even to our users, they don't think about us as solving this platform layer for defense. That's not how they think about us. They think about us in terms of what we're actually solving for them. Mm-hmm. That's all they really care about, and that's all they should care about, right? They don't think about it as a platform isn't really useful, until it's actually solving a real problem. So, for us, we spend a lot of our time focusing on actually delivering real applications to the users, but it is, it can be a challenge where, for every hour we spend on, some specific use case or application, the less we spend on the hour we don't spend on the broader infrastructure and all that needs to happen to improve that. The way we're working to address it right now is in the next month or so, we should be releasing the Legion V2, which is the second version of our API, which will natively support third-party development and all the documentation that goes along with that. Why that matters is we want to get to a place where any developer, whether they're building a new hardware or software system for the military, has the ability to actually build and deploy that themselves. And they're in a better place fundamentally to build these integrations than we are. They know their system better than we do. They will always do it. And so, we want to give them that power. The other side of that is they only want to do that if they can actually get money out of it. Sure. And so I think that's why, our ability to serve a bunch of use cases and have existing deployments across the world at this point is really valuable, because now if you're building a new software system like that, you already have a market, right? You already have that base to now deploy that piece of software, that hardware system into that you wouldn't have otherwise. You have to kind of build that all yourself. And now, building a nice software features is good if you can now have the infrastructure to run that on top of it. If not, you have to build the entire stack yourself. And that's a hugely capital intensive process and very, very slow and can and does kill companies every day in this industry. And we want to kind of help solve that and really help these companies, give them the infrastructure they need to build the applications that are really critical, and focus on those applications. Right, you don't have to build that control infrastructure again. It's not anything new, and it's not going to be really differentiated until you have that last 5 or 10%. That's where the real magic happens in this world, and help companies actually focus on building that versus everything underneath it.
I'm really curious. I saw one of your tweets, and you
it was very funny. It was like, like the elites don't want you to know that you can just build a factory and start like making stuff. And you make it sound so easy. And I'm genuinely curious, as someone who's like so far removed from this world, and I find this conversation really fascinating. I mean, and I know you had experience in this space, but like I imagine you mentioned the engineers earlier, like the experts that you need to be successful here are so different than just a SaaS company hiring engineers. And I'm curious like how you formed your team and like found people to supplement you where you didn't naturally have the expertise yourself.
Yeah, my background is actually purely in software, and it was I graduated with computer science in college, and then kind of got, just by the nature of working in this industry, you kind of have to touch hardware, right? And like you may be focusing on the software side, but like you still have to touch hardware at some level, and that's where I started working with that. I'm certainly not the best electrical or mechanical engineer by any stretch of the imagination, but ended up hiring one of the best engineers that I knew in the same research lab where I was working with Martin, who became my co-founder, and we started Mutual. So the engineer was a year or two behind us, and hired him out of that lab. And he's done a lot of really amazing work on both the electrical and mechanical side of building out these platforms. The flip side of that is I think people really overestimate how hard hardware is. It's expensive, sure. But the tooling that exists for building hardware today is so much better than it was even a couple of years ago. Right? Yeah. There are actually a guy I know, Kenneth Castle, just recently announced an API for building sheet metal. There was an announcement this past week on Twitter. He's been working on it for a while, and literally you can just now make an API call, upload your actual the file itself for the sheet metal drawing, and you'll have a part mailed to you in a week. That's amazing. Like that didn't exist before, and is really, really so good these days that you can actually do it very fast. You can be very efficient with it. You still have to be cognizant of the cost, and like cost can scale very, very fast. But generally speaking, most applications don't require like fully novel electrical designs or mechanical designs. A lot of the time, you can get pretty far with taking an assembly of many off-the-shelf components and writing some software to make them do novel things. And that'll get you, that first demo or that first prototype. And then from there, you can actually start experimenting. And like once you hit that product market fit, then invest in like doing things custom or doing things the more traditional way. But I think people often too often jump to that, and then they realize, well, I'm building a really advanced product that nobody cares about, which would be obviously a silly thing to do. We see this in software, but in software, that the cost of doing that was very low. The cost in hardware space is very high because you actually have to build that thing. And when you do hit sort of like design for manufacturing and building out like scaled production lines, you're now talking about like injection molded parts, which require $50,000 to $200,000 molds for these different components that then are produced in very large scale. Like you can burn a lot of money if you're building something that nobody cares about, or you need to start tweaking things. Well, that's another $200,000 mold. Like that's where cost really gets away from you. But before that, you shouldn't ever start talking about molds until you have a product you can simply no longer like 3D print fast enough with your printers running 24/7. Like that's the only time we should be starting to think about that. Anytime before that is sort of just hubris.
One question I had, in terms of now you're about to release, this third-party API for other kind of platform players to build on top of it. Do you think eventually you'll start spending more of your time, kind of essentially developing or helping to develop the kind of defense tech or whatever you want to call it, startup ecosystem, and then you could almost eventually imagine Picogrid being a conduit for how some of this, military, money is distributed because you have the infrastructure layer and you also might know kind of startup players around it. Like, how do you see that ecosystem developing with Picogrid as an important part of it?
I think that's exactly where we want to be. And I think a lot of these new players are building some really amazing advanced technology, solving really critical mission sets. And we want to be at the forefront of supporting those companies. And we have been at the forefront of supporting a lot of them, even before, like even without like the advantage for Picogrid, like even before we could actually serve some of these companies. We were still working closely with these companies and making introductions as we can. I'm just honestly very excited to see the industry develop as it has. But I also am aware that like things can and will change, right? If the next 5 or 10 years pass by and you have a bunch of these companies raise a bunch of money in defense, and they go belly up because they don't have any way to scale out, or like that, it takes way longer than they think it is, which is a very typical route in this industry. Then they will die, and then VC interest will move on, and that'll be that. And that now we'll end up with maybe 1 or 2 new players in the industry, and like period. Right? And like that'll be an abject failure for the industry and for us as an entire country. And so even outside of Picogrid, I'm just like I want these companies to survive because I understand how critical it is. Mm-hmm. And if we can build the infrastructure to make that happen, all the better. And I think we can and we should, because it's the new players that are moving faster, that are building the most advanced technology, and are the ones who really need to survive. They're also the ones who need help to survive, and to not have to focus on building everything else under the hood, because that's when they will just burn through all the money and go belly up.
I love that. I feel like it's when people talk about other founders in their space, sometimes it's very combative and competitive because you're fighting over, similar resources. But I love the idea that, you're fighting for and like building infrastructure for the whole industry, which is really interesting. I'm curious, actually, we talked earlier about like tourist species, of which I've seen many in all spaces, including this one. And I'm curious if you've seen like tourist founders, which I've seen a lot of spaces as well. And I know there's been a lot of criticism around like young, inexperienced founders doing lots of different things. But as we talked about, like in the space, it's like very critical and, life or death, literally. And I'm curious, like from your perspective, if you've seen that or think it's like a real threat to anything.
So I think young experienced founders are very essential, and doesn't necessarily mean that they are tourists, but there definitely are, like, I don't want to name names, but there definitely are tourist founders in this industry, like there are in every other industry, who are not serious about it, and who will, a contract will be taken by a competitor and they'll kind of throw up their hands and say, well, that's that, I'll move on to the next hot thing because I'm kind of bored with this. That happens in every industry. It's not unique to this world. And I think we're in for a bit of a pruning in this world. I think we're overdue for it, honestly, where there will probably be some loud failures, and that will probably cause some people to be like, this is not for me or whatever. That's fine. I think it's a healthy thing for the industry for that to happen. But there definitely are new founders in this world. I'm friends with a lot of them who are very serious about it and who really are here and bought into the mission for the right reasons. And I think that's what it's just kind of filtering those out, filtering out the ones who are not serious is probably best for everyone, including the people who are not serious about it, so they can go kind of work on something that actually gets them excited. If this is not the thing.
Speaking of kind of the more real elements of this industry, just curious, what are some outside of the Arizona deployment? Curious if there's a couple of projects and whatnot that you've worked on that, have made you most proud of what you all have accomplished.
Yeah. The ones that I'm most proud of are ones I can't speak too much to, because they touch a lot of combat operations. But broadly speaking, we are helping connect systems that have never worked together before in new and really interesting ways that are not obvious at first. And that's where I think the value of our technology is really highest, are those applications that, it's not just, so one application is, I think one of the things that I'm most proud of is supporting the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense in the war with Russia, where we are on the ground in Ukraine supporting actual combat operations with our technology. And primarily the way we got in was just helping with what's called sort of ISR, so intelligence, defense, reconnaissance, which is basically just putting out camera systems and understanding what's happening on the front lines. And we did this pro bono. Like we actually just wanted to do what we could to support. And we did benefit from it in the sense that we got a lot of really amazing feedback in real time, and we pushed out. We still are pushing out updates and improvements to the system in response to that, and that's going into combat in Ukraine. So it's pushed out. So like that's been really really useful. But I think where that gets particularly interesting is now these operators are able to sort of remotely control these camera systems and other devices in the field, and now start pulling that data in and combining with other systems, especially strike applications, which is important part I think to understand of what's happening in the military is you kind of can't shy away from that.
Mm-hmm.
But now combining like both ISR and strike in a new way and making that available to end users in ways that's just never been easily done before. Some say it hasn't been done before, but it's been very, very difficult. And oftentimes what we're talking about is, one person has one camera, and the person with the camera will see something, then they'll have to communicate to the person nearby with the strike system that usually, like in Ukraine, they're actually communicating over Discord and Signal for what's happening. And you can imagine how slow those feedback loops are versus allowing that single operator who's now controlling a bunch of cameras and a bunch of other systems in the field to now flip over to now control the strike system. And that just allows them to move much, much faster and become just a more effective fighting force. And that is, at the end of the day, the technology we're building will enable those sorts of applications at a very, very large scale. That I think is just so essential. It's just technology that just simply has to be built, and nobody else is out there building technology at the scale that we are, and that's something I'm most proud of, and we do a bunch of other applications across the country now, but I think that's one that really particularly stands out.
I'm curious about we talked about kind of the infrastructure you're building to enable other engineers and founders to be building in this space, and I'm curious about the problems that you feel like are the most important that people aren't building in right now.
Here's a good question. So I wouldn't say nobody's building this space, but it's a very complex space, is the broader world around electronic warfare, electronic surveillance. They generally go together. So that's understanding or both like offensive and defensive applications. We're seeing that the challenges of what's going on in Ukraine, a lot of sort of countermeasures. It's very much sort of a cat and mouse game, as a lot of sort of military technology is. It's a very cat and mouse game, but it's a old technology deployed in new ways, and we're seeing this change all the time. And I actually just speak with a founder who's in Ukraine right now, a week or two ago, and he's building some tech using a sort of a novel approach to combating electronic warfare. And it really got me thinking about just how essential that is. And in the future, we're getting to a more connected defense world, not a less connected one. Right. And so we have to be able to mitigate electronic warfare, because a lot of our systems will be crippled, not useless, but crippled without that ability to communicate at a very global scale. And so he's developing some really interesting technology that helps adapt that or combat that. And I think why that's interesting and why I think it's a space that more people should pay attention to is the players in this industry historically are just simply not equipped to build the next generation of electronic warfare resistant military radios. Yeah. And they are, I think what you have to have sort of a software defined capability where you can change how the radios operate on the fly in response to new ways in which the enemy is using their capabilities. And that changes all the time. It changes weekly, right? And so you can't have a fixed radio that you now need to go ship back to the manufacturer to be upgraded. You have to have that be sort of natively built in. You have to have IP support, right? We're talking about internet protocol support for supporting a lot of applications that we're seeing today, and all that's being built on it to take advantage of a lot of the tools that the software world has built out over the last decade or two. You have to build in default on encryption that a lot of the sort of consumer grade radios do not have. Military grade radios do, but oftentimes they're primarily designed for voice. Right? They're primarily designed as just glorified walkie-talkies, and that's really limiting for a lot of different applications, because then you as the operator are just limited to basically voice communications. So a lot of those things, I think that there is a space for probably a number of companies who built solving different parts of that with offensive and defensive applications around electronic surveillance and electronic warfare, and be able to support military radio networks in contested, they call DIL, like the non-standard communications environments that are interrupted, and like being able to operate elegantly in those worlds is really going to be a crucial part of current but also future conflicts as well.
Zane, before we get into rapid fire, really appreciate the time here. I learned so much every single time we chat from on kind of the whole space, from kind of the problems that you all are specifically solving, and every single time it's just like is illuminating in so many ways. So really appreciate it. Steph, you want to bring us home with some rapid fire?
For sure. Yeah. So these are questions that are easy, answer in a sentence or less, whatever comes to mind first kind of questions. So the first one is the founder that you look up to most.
Gabe Donocillo, the founder of Space, who was once roasted in some media platform as being unreasonably obsessed with unit economics. And I'd love to have that title one day.
Incredible.
Love it.
What job would you want to have if you couldn't be a founder?
Oh God, I don't know. Probably a hermit. I don't know. Like, I don't know if I could. I don't know
Is
if I
that
could
a
do
job? Interesting
I don't know
job
if I could
choice.
do a regular job.
Fair enough.
Love it.
Fair enough. What was your first entrepreneurial endeavor? It could be anything from like a childhood hobby that you were using to make money, all the way to like a company attempt or a side hustle. Anything.
Yeah, I think it was the first one was Michigan right out of college, where we were as contractors working for the Army Corps.
What was your first real job?
According to my family, I still have a real job. My first, what I consider my first real job was again Meshmeal and the work I was doing with the Army Corps right out of college.
And then the mega trend that you're most excited about, and it could be related to defense or your company, but it also could be just anything in the world that you're really excited about that you would think will drive more innovation or consumer behavior change.
Yeah, I think we're for the military we're at a really interesting point, in a big inflection point in how military systems operate across the board, that the legacy players are just not ready for. And it's sort of a new frontier, and that is supporting unmanned systems by the millions of all types. And I think it's a huge opportunity for a lot of new players to be built in this world, either building the unmanned systems themselves, or building the middleware like we are, or building the software applications that run on top of that, but building it at a scale that the current military systems are just not built for. They're built for maybe supporting hundreds or thousands of systems on a good day, and that is nowhere near the scale we need to be able to operate on to win the next conflict. And I think that's where I spend a lot of my time, and that's where a lot of the people I work with spend a lot of their time. And I think it's one thing that outside of this world people don't appreciate enough, and how essential it will be for any future conflict.
Absolutely. Zane, thank you so much. This has been amazing. Appreciate the time.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. You can find us at somethingnewpod.com. You can follow Steph at StephMui, MUI, on Twitter. You can follow myself, Lior, at LMushin on Twitter. Catch us again next time.
Cool. I thought it went well.